We finished 1 Samuel last week, so we'll be in 2 Samuel 1 through 4 tonight. 2 Samuel 1 through 4. But in starting 2 Samuel, we've been going through at the beginning the outline each week of 1 Samuel. But since we have finished 1 Samuel, we're going to go through the outline tonight, introduce the outline of 2 Samuel. Something to note about 2 Samuel, and we'll see this in the 4 chapters we're in tonight, is if you learned your 17 periods of Bible history that Brother Waldron did several years ago, you'll remember that there's the United Kingdom, Divided Kingdom, and Judah alone. However, there is a time frame in which David reigns, in which the kingdom is divided. We'll see that tonight. It's divided between him and between Ishbosheth. And that happens in chapter 2. So when it comes to the reign of David in 2 Samuel, we could divide it into 4 sections. The first 4 chapters, which is what we're looking at tonight, is his reign over Judah. He's only over Judah in this time frame. So in theory, the kingdom is actually divided at this point, though not for long, just a few years before it is united under David in chapter 5, which we'll see next week. But David is reigning over just Judah in 1 through 4. Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, is reigning over Israel at the time. Then beginning at chapter 5 and going through chapter 10 is his reign over all Israel. Now, he is reigning over all Israel for the rest of the book, but the reason we divide that in 5 through 10 is because something very important is going to happen in chapter 11 that marks a change. You know what that is? What happens in 2 Samuel chapter 11? David sinned with Bathsheba. So really beginning at chapter 11 and going through chapter 20 is not just his sin, but its long-lasting consequences. Because after chapter 12, where 11 the sin happens, 12 he's rebuked for it. From that point forward, we're going to see a change in the reign of David, and it's not as smooth as things were prior to that sin taking place. That's some long-term consequences that are going to result from that in 11 through 20. And then 21 through 24 is going to be David's final years of his reign. And then when we come into 1 Kings, in a couple more months, when we come into 1 Kings, that's when Solomon's going to take over. So chapters 1 through 4 tonight in the book of 2 Samuel is when he's reigning over just Judah. 5 through 10 is over all Israel. 11 through 20 is his sin and its consequences. And then 21 through 24 is David's final years. But 2 Samuel chapter 1, this is David's mourning for Saul and Jonathan. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 1. The first 16 verses are where he's going to learn about the deaths of Saul and of Jonathan. Look, beginning at verse 1. Now it came to pass after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, and David had stayed 2 days in Ziklag, on the 3rd day, behold, it happened that a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. So it was when he came to David that he fell on the ground and prostrated himself. And David said to him, "Where have you come from?" So he said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." Then David said to him, "How did the matter go? Please tell me." And he answered, "The people have fled from battle. Many of the people are fallen, and Saul and Jonathan his son are dead also." So David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and Jonathan his son are dead?" Then the young man who told him said, "As I happened by chance to be on Mount Gilboa, there was Saul leaning on his spear, and indeed the chariots and the horsemen followed hard after him. Now when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me, and I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' So I answered him, 'I am an Amalekite.' He said to me, 'Please stand over me and kill me, for anguish has come upon me, but my life still remains in me.' So I stood over him and killed him, because I was sure that he would not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the bracelet that was on his arm, and have brought them here to my Lord." We'll stop right there for just a moment. We'll pick up at the rest of this story. But so far, what's taking place here in 2 Samuel chapter 1? Right, and we'll see that even more here in a second. But to this point, as if you remember from last week, how does Saul actually die in 1 Samuel chapter 31? Falls on his sword. Remember, he's laying there, and he knows that he's near death. He knows that he's been attacked. He's not going to make it. But he's afraid of what the Philistines are going to do when they come and find the king of Israel here in the midst of the fallen of the battle, what they'll do to him before they kill him. And so he turns to his armor bearer and tells the armor bearer to kill him. The armor bearer was afraid and did not. Then Saul fell on his own sword, and then the armor bearer took his own life after he saw that his master had died. But the Amalekite comes to David and tells him what instead? That he killed him. Why do you think he told David this story? He's looking for something from David. What's the general thought among the people of Israel that Saul himself possessed? What's the general thought that some of the people have been pushing towards Saul, some of Saul's men, about David? That he's your enemy. And so this man probably thought that if I come and I tell David, whose enemy is Saul, that I have killed David, maybe he'll give me some reward. After all, he's to be the next king. He could give me some position of authority in the kingdom, maybe. He could give me some wealth. Maybe just a good pat on the back. Something from David. He expected something from David. Something you expect is not the something we're fixing to see he got. But he's sort of expecting this pat on the back from David or something like that. You would think to come and to tell this story. But look, beginning at verse 11. Therefore, David took hold of his clothes and tore them and said, so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. So here they tear their clothes and they weep as they customarily would. The tearing of the clothes and the weeping that takes place here. They weep for Saul. Remember, what's David called Saul repeatedly to this point? God's anointed. And they may have disagreed, and it may be that David understands he's coming to the throne, but that's still the Lord's anointed that has died. And so he weeps for Saul. More so, he weeps for who? Jonathan, who was close friends with David. We'll see that later on in the same text where it's mentioned. But not only does he weep for Saul and Jonathan, who else fell that day? Many. The sons and many of the people of Israel. We need to understand something. We talked about this last week, that you remember that in 1 Chronicles 10, it told us that Saul died because of what? Because of his sin. But on that day, it wasn't just Saul that died. It was 3 of his sons and many of the men of Israel. They all suffered consequences from what Saul has done. So they're weeping for Saul, they're weeping for Jonathan, and they're weeping for the house of Israel, who's lost many people in this battle. And so this mourning is taking place for them. But I think it's interesting to note in verse 13 that David says to the young man who told him, "Where are you from?" And he said, "I am the son of an alien, an Amalekite." So David said to him, "How was it you were not afraid to put forth your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" David looks at this young man, this man that comes to him, who says, "Hey, I killed the king." And again, this young man probably thought, here's going to be some power or prestige coming my way because I've taken care of the next king's enemies. And David turns and he asks him a question. Why were you not afraid to put forth your hand and destroy the Lord's anointed?
I think David had a real concern, very concerned about what was going on. Because he had any chances to kill Saul. He loved Saul and all the authority. And Jonathan and
Right.
So that's a big concern.
There's the love that he has for them. But aside from just the love itself, what else is spurring David's asking of this question? It's the Lord's anointed. And remember, David understands that. We've seen that on 2 occasions when he's talking back in 1 Samuel, where he had the chance in the cave and he had the chance in the valley to kill him. And both times he does not. But we need to understand something here. Whether or not Saul asked the young man to take his life. Remember, the young man tells David that Saul had asked him. Please stand over me, verse 9, and kill me. So the way that David's heard the story is that Saul even asked this young man. But David understands and is wanting to know from this man, why is it you weren't afraid to raise your hand against the Lord's anointed? Ultimately, whether Saul asked for it or not, it would be a sign of disrespect to raise your hand and to kill the leader. And David is concerned about this man's reaction, that it doesn't even seem to bother him that he killed Saul. You know, it would have been, I don't think David would have reacted differently in what we're fixing to see in a moment as to how he responds to the guy. But I do think that it would have been a little bit different if the guy had come and he told the story, and maybe David seems to think that this man doesn't care. Now, he does have his clothes torn and dust on his head, as he would in mourning in verse 2. But David seems concerned by this man that he raises his hands against the Lord's anointed. Remember, we said this young man is expecting something from David in return. Well, David's fixing to give him something. Look at verse 15. So David calls to one of the young men and said, "Go near and execute him." And he struck him so that he died. So David said to him, "Your blood is on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed." So here he comes to David and he says, "Hey, I killed King Saul." This man's expecting something from David. Well, because of what he's done, and that his story is he raised his hand against the Lord's anointed, David has him executed. David puts him to death for what he says he did. And David says to him, "Your blood is on whom?" Yourself. It's on your own head, because you have testified saying, "I have killed the Lord's anointed." And so your testimony is what has put you to death here this day. And so your blood is on your own head. Yes. Yes. And too, what I think is interesting in this, by the way, I don't know where this Amalekite was at the time that has escaped, but remember that Saul actually asked his armor bearer to kill him. And then the Amalekite says that Saul said it to him and that he did it, even though Saul took his own life. I wonder if maybe this guy wasn't somewhere close to within earshot, that he already knew the story of what was asked. Maybe somebody that was nearby just simply hears Saul ask somebody, "Will you take my life?" so that I don't fall into their hands. And then this guy tells the story, and maybe they don't know that Saul fell on his own sword. They just know that Saul has died, and they've heard this, and this is the story that's going around. Maybe he was close by, because his story does mirror quite closely what was told in 1 Samuel of what Saul asked his armor bearer. But one way or the other, he's put to death for what he did. But the beginning of verse 17, it's what is referred to. And verse 18 is the song of the bow. Look, beginning at verse 17, we'll read through this. "Then David lamented with his lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. And he told them to teach the children of Judah the song of the bow. Indeed, it is written in the book of Jasher, the beauty of Israel is slain on your high places, how the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. O mounts of Gilboa, let there be no dew nor rain upon you, nor fields of offspring. For the shield of the mighty is cast away there, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return empty. Saul and Jonathan were beloved and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. O daughter of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan was slain in your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Jonathan, you have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. So that's the song of the both that's written here, the song of lamentation for the death of Saul and for the death of Jonathan. And this song is sung here lamenting that. I do want to note real quick, we're going to move on to chapter 2 in just a second, but do take note in verse 26. Some try and take and teach this verse that there was something more than a friendship between Jonathan and David from verse 26, because it says, your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. Well, the love there, talking about the love there, that's just showing the closeness of their relationship and the friendship that they had. And those that are trying to take it and make it some sexual relationship are taking and twisting that word love there. But that's not what the song's referring to. It's just referring to the closeness of the friendship and the love and concern that David and Jonathan have for one another. And so this is one of those things that people take and try and twist to teach that, but he's just simply referring to the fact of how close him and Jonathan were. In fact, he referred to him as my brother Jonathan. Yes. Right, and the context is in the midst of mourning for him, and he calls him, again in the same verse, he calls him his brother. And that's the kind of close love and friendship that they shared. And that's what he's referring to here in verses 26 and 27, or 26. Chapter 2, this is where both David and Ishbosheth are going to be made kings. David and Judah and Ishbosheth over Israel. Look, beginning at verse 1. David is anointed king of Judah, 1 through 7. It happened after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, go up. David said, where shall I go up? And he said, to Hebron. So David went up there, and his 2 wives with him, Ahinoam the Jezreelite, and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. And David brought up there men who were with him, every man with his household, so they dwelt in the cities of Hebron. Then the men of Judah came, and they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, the men of Jabesh-Gilead were the ones who buried Saul. So David said to the men of Jabesh-Gilead, or sent messengers to the men of Jabesh-Gilead, and said to them, you are blessed of the Lord, for you have shown kindness to your Lord, to Saul, and have buried him. And now may the Lord show kindness and truth to you. I also will repay you with kindness, because you have done this thing. Now therefore let your hands be strengthened and be valiant, for your master Saul is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. A couple of important things to note here. Number 1, verse 1. This is something we've seen a pattern of in the life of David, mostly before he goes to battle, that he does this. But in this case, we have an indication where he's not going to battle, but before an important decision, and that is, what does David do? He inquires of the Lord. You know, in this situation, David needs to know now, do I need to go up to the cities of Judah? And if so, where do I go? David doesn't just make this decision as, hey, I'm going to go to the cities of Judah, or I'm going to go over here. He inquires of God first. You know, and we've talked about this several times. This shows the wisdom of David, and that he wants to make sure and ask of God before he makes his decision. Remember, when we're going throughout the story of David, there was a chapter that David was willing to react without inquiring of God first. And that was the story of him and Nabal before Abigail intervenes and stops him. But in that case, he doesn't inquire of God. But you go through these other stories, and David's inquiring of God. He asks of God. He inquires of God time and time again. But then he goes up and he is anointed king of Judah. He's anointed over Judah as the king. But David is told what in verse 4? He becomes king over Judah. And then once David gets there, what do they tell him? About Jabesh-Gilead. Remember we saw last week what was done to Saul's bodies, where they had taken them, they had cut off the heads, they'd hung the bodies on the wall, the Philistines had. And it was the men of Jabesh-Gilead who came in and got the body of Saul and of his sons, burned and buried them. Burned them and buried the bones. So the story that's told here, David, it was the men of Jabesh-Gilead that buried Saul. So he says that he will show kindness. He said that for the kindness that have shown to their Lord Saul, may the Lord show you kindness, and that he also would repay their kindness because they have done this thing. In verse 6. Because they had shown some respect to Saul, and that they went and got his bodies. Because whether you agree with Saul or not, the way to treat a king after he has died is not to cut off his head and hang him on a wall and leave him out in the city. And the men of Jabesh-Gilead did not like the fact that was done, mostly because, remember we talked about this last week, back in chapter 11, that Saul had come to Jabesh Gilead's defense when they were under siege and had protected the men of Jabesh Gilead. And so that's part of the reason they come back and repay that. But here David is anointed king of Judah. But at the same time, verse 8 and going through verse 11, but Abner the son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth the son of Saul and brought him to Mahanaim. And he made him king over Gilead, over the Asherites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, over Benjamin, and over all Israel. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. Only the house of Judah followed David. And the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. And so David is anointed king, and Ishbosheth while David's king over Judah, Ishbosheth was anointed by Abner as king over Israel. This is going to put some strife and enmity between the two, because we're going to see the two at war with one another at verse 12 and going through the end of this text. Now Abner the son of Ner and the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. And Joab the son of Zeruiah and the servants of David went out and met them by the pool of Gibeon. So they sat down, one on one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. Then Abner said to Joab, "Let the young men now arise and compete before us." And Joab said, "Let them arise." So they arose and went by number, 12 from Benjamin, followers of Ishbosheth the son of Saul, and 12 from the servants of David. And each one grasped his opponent by the head and thrust his sword into his opponent's side, so they fell down together. Therefore the place was called the Field of Sharp Swords, which is in Gibeon. So there was a very fierce battle that day, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. So here they come out, and they are on either side of this pool, and the decision's made. Abner said to Joab, "Let them arise and compete before us." So Joab says, "Let them arise." They come out, they compete, they grab their opponent by the head, each one thrusts the other to the side, and they all die. The 12 men from Benjamin that was following Ishbosheth, and 12 of the servants of David. But then this very fierce battle ensues that day between Abner and the men of Israel and between David's men. And it is David's men that are victorious because they beat Israel's army. But pick up at verse 18. Now the sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab and Abishai and Asahel. And Asahel was as fleet of foot as a wild gazelle. That's pretty quick. So Asahel pursues Abner, and in doing so, and in going, he did not turn to the right hand or to the left from following Abner. So here Abner takes off running, and who's pursuing him? Asahel is pursuing him. He's chasing him down. He's very fast. Abner must have had some kind of a head start for it to take a little bit for this conversation to ensue before he catches him. But Abner looks behind and says, "Are you Asahel?" And he answered, "I am." So what does Abner tell him to do in verse 21? Turn aside to the right, turn to the left, lay hold of one of the young men and take his armor for yourself. But he doesn't turn aside from following Abner. So Abner said to Asahel, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I face your brother Joab?" Abner is anointed Ishbosheth the king of Israel. And we're going to see more from Abner later on in the next chapter. But there's something to be said. Abner does not want to kill him, Asahel, here in this text. He tells him to do what? Turn aside. How is it I can face your brother if I kill you? But he refuses to turn aside, and therefore Abner struck him in the stomach with the blunt end of the spear, so the spear came out of his back, and he fell down there and died on the spot. So it was that as many as came to the place where Asahel fell and died stood still. Abner's given him a chance to turn around. He doesn't turn around. Imagine Abner's probably running with Asahel following behind him. He says, "Turn aside." He won't turn aside. "Turn aside and take one of the young men's armor for yourself." He doesn't turn aside. "Turn back. I don't want to kill you." He doesn't turn back. So Abner takes and he runs him through as he gets closer. Joab and Abishai also pursued Abner, and the sun was going down, verse 24, when they came to the hill of Alma, which is in Gihah, by the road to the wilderness of Gibeon. Now the children of Benjamin gathered together behind Abner and became a unit and took their stand on top of the hill. Then Abner called to Joab and said, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that it will be bitter in the latter end? How long will it be then until you tell the people to return from pursuing their brethren?" And Joab said, "As God lives, unless you had spoken, surely then by morning all the people would have given up pursuing their brethren." So Joab blew a trumpet, and all the people stood still and did not pursue Israel any more, nor did they fight any more. Then Abner and his men went on all the night through the plain, crossed over the Jordan, and went through all of Bithron, and they came to Mahanaim. You know, at this point, Abner makes a very good point here about the fact that the two are fighting, about the fact that Judah and Israel are fighting. And he asks Joab, how long will they continue and sword devour the other? How long will they until you tell the people to return from pursuing what? Your brethren. Their brethren. You know, Israel's fighting amongst themselves at this point, but Israel and Judah are brethren. And they're going to have enough enemies to fight without fighting one another. When you think about it, there is enough battles they would have to fight when divided that fighting each other isn't going to serve any good purpose. Now, while they're divided here over who to serve, I do think there's an important lesson that we can learn from that text today. And that is that we need to make sure, like they were, that we're not fighting with our brethren. You know, we not be going after our brethren. Brethren should be united, and that's what eventually Abner's going to come to David in chapter 3 and try and do, is unite the two together under David's leadership. But the problem is right now they are divided and they are fighting one another. But he said something to Joab about how long will this continue, and Joab blew his trumpet, said, "As God lives, unless you had spoken," verse 27, "surely that by morning all the people would have given up pursuing their brethren." But Joab blew his trumpet, they stand still, and they don't pursue Israel or fight them anymore. Abner and his men returned to Mahanaim. In verse 29, and Joab returned from pursuing Abner. And when he had gathered together the people, they were missing of David's servants 19 men in Ashahel. And the servants of David had struck down of Benjamin and Abner's men 360 men who died. And they took up Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb, which was in Bethlehem. And Joab and his men went all night, and they came to Hebron at daybreak. You know, at this point, they've stopped pursuing, but I think it's interesting to note the stark contrast. David has how many tribes following him? One. But when they send out people to fight, they're picking out of the men here that they send to fight the men of just Benjamin. They send Benjamin to fight, which, by the way, is the tribe that who is from? Saul is from, which means that's the tribe of Ishbosheth. And so it's men of Benjamin going out to fight the men of Judah. But when they go and fight, how many men does David lose? 19. Not counting Joab's brother. 19 men and Ashahel. So 19 men other than that. So there would have been 20 total. How many men does Benjamin lose? 360 men. Now, I don't know if this 19 counts the 12 that came out where they all each killed each other. But if that's the case, then he only lost 7 men. Says Ashahel, who was pursuing Abner before they chased off Israel. Even if it doesn't include the 12, you're talking 31 or 32 men, counting Ashahel. That's not a lot of casualties in a battle. Not when the opposing army loses 360 men. So I think it's interesting to note there in this battle how many people that Benjamin loses in this fight versus the men in Judah. Because ultimately, who is God with? He's with David. And so David's side is the side that is victorious. But let's move on into chapter 3 now. David and Abner here in chapter 3. The first 5 verses are going to list the sons of David. Some of these are not yet that he has to this point. When we get later on, we're going to have sons listed again in chapter 5 next week. But it lists here the sons. He had Amnon by Ahinoam the Jezreelite. His second was Shiliah by Abigail, the widow of Nabal. The third was Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmah, the king of Geshur. The fourth was Adonijah the son of Haggith, the fifth, Shephatai, the son of Abital, and the sixth was Ithream, by wife's David Eglah, and these were born to David while he was at Hebron, or in Hebron. By the way, there are two of these names that are going to become very important later on in the book. There's Amnon in chapter 13, and then Absalom, who leads rebellion against David. Those two names are going to become important. Those were born to him while he's at Hebron. And again, those names are important. We'll need to remember those because we're going to come to those in a few weeks when we get later on in the book. But beginning at verse 6 and going through 21, this is where Abner's going to come and join David. Abner comes to David and proposes peace. Let's pick up in verse 6. Now it was so that there was still war, but there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, that Abner was strengthening his hold on the house of Saul. You kind of get the picture as he's strengthening his hold on the house of Saul. Ishbosheth is the king, but who's really the one pulling the strings here? It's Abner. He's strengthening his hold. In fact, it's not going to be very long after Abner's going to die later in this text before Ishbosheth's going to die and the kingdom completely comes over to David, which Abner was bringing it to him anyway. Abner made the decision to bring them over and hand the kingdom over to David. Ishbosheth would not have done such, but it's Abner that comes. It's Abner that really seems to be pulling the strings here. But Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, verse 7, the daughter of Ahi. So Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Why have you gone into my father's concubine?" And Abner became very angry at the words of Ishbosheth and said, "Am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah? Today I show loyalty to the house of Saul your father, to his brothers and to his friends, and have not delivered you into the hand of David, and you charge me today with fault concerning this woman. May God do so to Abner and more also, if I do not do for David as the Lord has sworn to him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah from Dan to Beersheba." And he could not answer Abner another word because he feared him. So the first thing that happens here is Ishbosheth questioning him about being with his father, about being with Saul's concubine. And Abner makes the point to him, "Listen, I've showed loyalty to you. I've showed loyalty to your father's house." Remember, Abner was over the armies of Saul when Saul was king. He's the one that has anointed Ishbosheth as king. He's trying to, I've showed loyalty to your house, to you and your father's house. I could have handed you over to David, but I didn't. But now what? Now what's he says he's going to do? I'm going to hand you over. But God do so to Abner and more also, if I do not do for David as the Lord has sworn to him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul to set up the throne of David over Israel. That's what he's going to do. By the way, here's something that tells me something about Abner's the one pulling the strings. What's Ishbosheth's reaction? He's afraid. If Ishbosheth could have, being the king over Israel, could have just had Abner executed. Abner, he could have said, "Abner, you're being rebellious to me, I'm going to have you executed." But he feared Abner, was afraid about what Abner was going to do, and Abner's response. But Abner's going to send messengers to David saying, "Whose is the land?" saying, "Also make your covenant with me, and indeed my hand shall be with you, and bring all Israel to you," in verse 12. And David said, "Good, I will make a covenant with you. But one thing I require of you, you shall not see my face unless" what? Unless Abner brings who? Brings Michal, Saul's daughter, which was David's wife, when you come to see my face. So David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, "Give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for 100 foreskins of Philistines." So Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, from Palatiel, the son of Laish. Then her husband went along with her to Bahurim, weeping behind her. So Abner said to him, "Go, return." And he returned. Now Abner had communicated, verse 17, with the elders of Israel, saying, "In time past you were seeking for David to be king over you. Now then do it. For the Lord has spoken of David, saying, by the hand of my servant David, I will make my people Israel I will save my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and the hands of all their enemies." And Abner also spoke in the hearing of Benjamin. Then Abner also went to speak in the hearing of David in Hebron, and all that seemed good to Israel, and the whole house of Benjamin. The house of Benjamin, the very tribe that Ishbosheth from, is behind Abner in this. Because ultimately, when you go back, they wanted David over them. Back when Saul was king, they understood David was anointed. He makes the point to them, in time past you were seeking for David to be king over you. Now do it. You wanted him to be king before, make him king now. And so Abner goes and speaks to him. So Abner and 20 men with him came, verse 20, to David at Hebron, and David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. Then Abner said to David, I will arise and go and gather all Israel to my lord the king, that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may reign over all the hearts your heart desires. So David sent Abner away. He went in peace. At that moment, the servants of David and Joab came. We'll pick up in 22 in a second. Abner comes and he talks to David, and how does Abner leave? There's no threat. They leave in peace. He went in peace. There's an agreement now. Abner says, I'm going to hand the house of Israel over to you. You're going to be king over all Israel. I'm going to hand them over to you. The power that had been given to Ishbosheth, that's going to be handed over to you. David, you're going to rule over all Israel. But remember, who did Abner kill? In the previous chapter. Joab's brother. So let's pick up in verse 22. This is where Joab's going to kill him. At that moment, the servants of David and Joab came from a raid and brought much spoil with them. But Abner was not with David in Hebron, for he had sent him away. He had gone in peace. When Joab and all the troops that were with him had come, they told Joab, saying, Abner the son of Ner came to the king, and he sent him away, and he has gone in peace. Then Joab came to the king and said, What have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why is it that you sent him away, and he is already gone? Surely you realize that Abner, the son of Ner, came to deceive you, to know you're going out and you're coming in, and to know all that you are doing. And so Joab comes to David and says, listen, Abner's deceiving you. And when Joab, verse 26, had gone from David's presence, he sent messengers after Abner, who brought him back to the well of Sirah, but David did not know it. Now when Abner had returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the gate to speak with him privately, and there he stabbed him in the stomach, so that he died for the blood of Asahel his brother. Afterward then David heard of it and said, My kingdom and I are guiltless before the Lord forever of the blood of Abner the son of Zer. Let it rest on the head of Joab and on all his father's house, and there never fail to be in the house of Joab one who is a discharger or is a leper, who leans on a staff or falls by the sword or lacks bread. And David curses Joab's family in verse 29 because Joab has taken the life of Abner. So Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel at Gibeon in the battle. And then verse 31, David's going to mourn for Abner. So David said to Joab and all the people who are with him, Tear your clothes, gird yourselves in sackcloth, and mourn for Abner. And King David followed the coffin. And they buried Abner in Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. And the king sang a lament over Abner and said, Should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, nor your feet put in fetters. As a man falls before wicked men, so you fell. Then all the people wept over him again. When all the people came to persuade David to eat, he said he would not eat until the sun had gone down. So they took note of it in verse 36, and it pleased them, since whatever the king did pleased all the people. And the people of Israel, verse 37 says, For all the people and all Israel understood that day that it had not been to the king's intent to kill Abner the son of Ner. And the king said to his servants, Do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? And I am weak today, though anointed king, and these men, the sons of Zerah, are too harsh for me, then the Lord shall repay the evildoer according to his wickedness. And David mourns for Abner. He makes the point about Abner here, that he called him, he said, a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel. Abner was the made commander of Saul's army, and Abner anointed Ishbosheth, but ultimately Abner was willing to make peace, and Abner had made some decisions there for the sake of peace. He had reached out to Joab and said, how long would you pursue your brethren? He tried to get Joab's brother to turn aside instead of killing him. And then he's the one that wants to come unite the kingdom. But Joab deceives him and kills Abner. And so David mourns for Abner here, mourns for him here in this text. I do think it's interesting, though, in verse 31, that he tells Joab and all the people who are with him to tear your clothes, gird yourselves in sackcloth, and mourn for Abner. So he commands Joab, the man that killed him, and the man I don't think it didn't seem to bother Joab, because Joab thought, hey, it's what he deserved. that he tells Joab and all his men to mourn the loss of Abner with him. We'll run through chapter 4 rather quickly so we get to some practical lessons. This is where Ishbosheth is killed. We're introduced at the beginning, at verse 4, or beginning of verse 1, it talked about how the sons heard that Abner had died in Hebron. When Saul's son had heard it, that he lost heart and all Israel was troubled. And now Saul's son had 2 men who were captains of troops. The name of one was Baanah, and the name of the other was Rechab, the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothalite of the children of Benjamin. For Beeroth was also part of Benjamin, because of the Beerharites fled to Gittim, and have been sojourners there until this day. Verse 4 does note about Mephibosheth, who we'll learn more about later on, but it's the son of Jonathan who's lame in verse 4. But 1 through 8 is really dealing mostly with the death of Ishbosheth. These 2 men that are mentioned previously, they set out and came the heat of the day, in verse 5, to the house of Ishbosheth, who was lying on his bed at noon. And they came there all the way in the house as though to get wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. And then they're going to cut off his head, and they're going to take it to David. And they come to David and say, hey, here's the head of Ishbosheth. Now, these 2 men seem to think the same way that this man of chapter 1 thought about saying, hey, I killed Saul. Hey, if we kill Ishbosheth and we take Ishbosheth's head to David, maybe David will give us some power, some prestige, maybe a pat on the back, something for killing Ishbosheth. But David responds to these 2 men in 9 through 12 and has them executed, just like he did the man in the previous, in chapter 1. Look at verse 10. Or pick up at verse 9. But David said to Rechab and Baanah, his brother, the sons of Rimmon the Beerharite, and said to him, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from adversity, when someone told me, saying, look, Saul is dead, thinking to have brought good news, I arrested him and had him executed in Ziklag, the one who thought I would give him a reward for his news. How much more when wicked men have gone and killed a righteous person in his own bed? Therefore shall I not require his blood at your hand and remove you from the earth? So David commanded his young men, and they executed them, cut off their hands and feet, and hanged them by the pool of Hebron. And they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the tomb of Abner in Hebron. So these men come to him thinking, hey, we got some good news for you. We killed Ishbosheth. Kingdom is all yours now. And David says, listen, if Saul was my enemy who pursued me, and when somebody said they killed him, I arrested them and had them executed at Ziklag, which, by the way, is before David is king in Hebron. Then what do you suppose I'm going to do to you that you've killed this righteous man? Ishbosheth had done nothing against David. What do you suppose that I'm going to do to you for killing him if I did this to the man that killed the man that tried to kill me? And so he has them executed here. Let's look back to some practical lessons. What are some practical lessons we see in this text? Vengeance belongs to the Lord. Right. Vengeance is the Lord's. A couple of these, our time is almost out. We do see the importance of respecting our leaders and the way that David responds when Saul is killed. Mourning of a loss, one can mourn for the loss. We mourn not as those that don't have hope, we see in 1 Thessalonians, but we can mourn for those that we've lost. I do think we see capital punishment here in David's response to those that have executed Ishbosheth. You've killed an innocent man, your life is required of you. Importance of having God on your side and how David is victorious. And that Joab's anger made him think unclearly, and that he would have Abner killed for what Abner did, even though Abner really didn't want to harm his brother. We'll pick up next week. We'll study chapters 5 and 6, and then we'll study 1 Chronicles 11 through 16.